they nuked people in Japan. And at the same time, what happens? We got like poison gas, and it's outlawed in after World War One, and all the major powers sign, and everyone expects Nazi Germany to use the gas, and they never do. You know, they surround Leningrad, and instead of simply gassing the whole population dead, they sit there and wait for it to surrender. And they don't surrender, of course, but they don't gas them all. Why not? If the Germans were so barbaric, and if they really thought that lowly of all people that they were simply targets or things in the way, you think that even in the sake of military efficiency, you would think that the Germans would just gas Leningrad and free up all those other forces for the rest of the front, but they don't. So conflating competence with barbarism. Because they're successful at the game, we accuse them of cheating or being terrible players. Now, if it isn't militarism that we pin on Germany, it's Nazism. But let's be honest with ourselves. Especially in the United States, when most people think of Nazism, there's only three things that come to mind, and there's only three things that they really know. One is that they're racist. Two is that they killed Jews. And three, they were led by a guy with a funny mustache called Adolf Hitler. That's it. They have no knowledge of their policies, their foundations, the social context, even World War I, the big reason why that even occurred. They have no idea of the actual methods they used, the administration. They have no idea the links between the military and the Nazi Party, which were very strenuous because there were a lot of people who didn't like the Nazis. There's no sympathy for the average German who's swept up in mob thought. Even Patton, he was talking about the political realities. Hey, we got to build Germany back up. We can't just hate on these people because they got swept up in something which wasn't entirely their fault. It wasn't entirely up to some random individual person, any more than you can say that individual Americans are totally complicit in the current activities of current administrations, which they may not have even voted for. But there isn't any sympathy for that. We always say, well, if you dodge sympathy, if you dodge responsibility for it, well, that just gives you free license to do it again. But it doesn't. It doesn't work that way. It's a double standard, if anything, because then we'd have to apply it to ourselves, and then we're guilty of a crap load even today. But that aside, this Nazism, all they know is that it's racist. They don't know anything about it. Just that it's there. That's all it is. But it's this knee-jerk reaction to it. Now, one of my relatives, should not be named, is a World War II veteran. He served in Europe. Brought back some war paraphernalia. We've got German heritage, so it was interesting for him, with his ancestors being German immigrants in the United States, to see what was going on in the whole anti-German sentiment, World War I and II. And this relative of mine discussed things with my brother, older brother. And my older brother goes to school one day. He's in, third grade or something. So he's pretty young, doesn't really know any better. And he can't stop talking about this because he finds it interesting. And one kid says, hey, I know there's this thing called a swastika, but I don't know what it is. Can you draw it for me? And my brother says, sure. You see, it was like this, and it requires this, and that's what it is, so that's what it looks like. That's the kind of thing that they, use to designate themselves. And the kid goes, okay, and then immediately turns around and rats him out to a teacher. And instead of the teacher saying, well, what were you doing? Why did you draw this? Instead of the teacher asking about, I don't know, the fact that his family member was talking about it was a veteran. Instead of doing any of that, they suspend him from school. They take this kid Doesn't know any better. And they kick them out of school. Now, nowadays, you have people kicking kids out of school for doodling, like, guns and stuff in notebooks. We have people kicking kids out of school for, having a water pistol in their backpack. Now, that's today's modern insanity, where these kids just being kids are, thrown away. But we're talking about 20 years ago here. 20 plus. We're talking about the point in time where things were supposedly still sane by modern standards, and they still kicked him out. Kicked him, a little kid, kicked him out of school. Didn't ask any questions. Just, you're gone. Go. After that, my mother actually pulled him out of that school, but you can't really escape that. And just to prove that you can't really escape it, I went to a totally different school. And one day I was reading a history book about World War II. And remember, I've got some German heritage, so I've got some vaguely Germanic features. And I will never forget, I'm sitting there reading a World War II book, and somebody calls me a Nazi. And they say, I'm going to go tell the teacher that you're a Nazi. And I close the book and put it away. I felt shame for something which had absolutely nothing to do with me and was so tenuously linked to that circumstance. But I knew that there was a threat. I knew what had happened to my brother. I knew what that infamous N-word, not the other N-word, this N-word meant. And I was ashamed. I was ashamed to have been reading history. And I didn't understand why. I was just a little kid, I was reading history. I didn't totally understand what I was reading. But you got to give me some credit for trying. But all the same, I had no idea why I was ashamed. I was just instinctively ashamed and instinctively afraid. I mean, and this is even at a point in time where I was, rational enough to say, well, if someone tells a complete and utter and stupid lie about me and then tells the teacher, I'm not going to be afraid because I know that I didn't and I'm perfectly fine and I can prove it. I was at that stage. This was something that even I couldn't explain at that time. But it was there and it was very real. Now, while I'm on the subject of educational experience, how about Germany and Nazism and Teutophobia in high school? Well, I'll never forget, I took high-level history courses in high school. And they said virtually nothing about Prussia, very little about Germany, and even less about Nazis. And I'll also never forget one of my teachers distinctly saying, well, the reason we're not going to talk about World War II is because, well, everybody already understands that. We already know what happened. We're in high school. It's supposedly considered one of the foundational educational levels nowadays. And you have a teacher, a professional teacher, saying, you already know. Well, that's funny. I was really the only kid that I was aware of who was cracking open history books about World War II at any point between that story and high school. They didn't really know. They didn't really study it. They had no idea. But they know. Guess it doesn't need to be covered, does it? Now, college comes up and, well, I didn't take any history courses in college. You could thank the advanced courses in high school for that. And I did manage to snag a German language course. It turned out to be the only course offered, surrounded by dozens and dozens of Chinese, Spanish, Japanese, you name it, French, Italian, one German class. But hey, maybe people just aren't interested in German that year. Who knows? But when I actually got there was this intense aversion, even by the students who had signed up, to ask about anything related to German history or German culture. They wanted to learn the language and get out. Maybe the other classes had filled up and they were pressed, ganged, I don't know. But even they who were supposedly interested were afraid of it. And if you think that that's bad, the teacher herself, she starts talking about tourism one day and starts talking about all of these wonderful sights that you can see. Now, mind you, she was a citizen of Germany through this whole period, so she knows what it was like to watch as your country gets divided, ripped apart with dissent, moving back and forth across the country. You don't know what's going on. You're afraid. People look at you with scornful eyes. You know, the mass media portrays you as all evil Nazis, complicit in murder and death. You know, you live in one place, and the next minute that place belongs to Poland. And rather predictably, she starts reminiscing, because she's using her personal experience to talk about these places that you find in tourist traps. And she starts reminiscing, and she thinks about her homeland, which just so happened to be East Prussia. And she starts talking about good sights in there, but then she stops. She stops very abruptly. And instead of saying, in Königsberg, and she stops. And she had just shifted over to her heritage here, and she stops. Well, anyway, and she moves on. So you have a German citizen who lived through it, who's teaching it to foreign students decades after the fact, can't even share a personal anecdote about her own damn childhood. That's how afraid she is. I ran into actual German-speaking students who are foreign exchange students in college. They're the same way. You would think that as a foreigner, especially coming from a well-to-do European country where they have ridiculously better grades than the United States, all the stupid kids over here, you would think that they would be proud of that, and that maybe they'd let a little bit of ego slip through, and hey, we're better than Americans. You Americans are slobs. But even if it's not that, you'd think that Americans would ask them questions because it's new and exciting, and we're living in a good multicultural, leftist, liberal community, and we would love to hear about your country. The funny thing is, I don't really recall people asking those students about Germany. And when I asked them about Germany, it didn't have anything to do with the wars. I didn't even have to specify the wars. All I needed to do was specify Prussia. And they bristled, and they equivocated, and they dodged it, and they were afraid. So you have American citizens who have this notion, which is apparently understood from birth, that Germans are evil, and you have Germans themselves who are literally afraid to talk about anything German. So, case in point, they see something German and they recoil. Why? Well, I don't know why. We've got this notion that Germans are all evil, but we've already covered how they weren't necessarily as barbaric in war, how their militarism really wasn't too much worse than any other country, how they actually had a very good period of rational, peace-loving, scientific and economic development. So those get shot in the foot. Not all Germans are Nazis. That should stand to reason, considering there was such revolt in the first place. Clearly diversity of opinion. So they're not all Nazis. Nazis driven underground in Germany. It's illegal. You get thrown in prison. So that's